The relentless sun beat down from the zenith, a blazing orb of fire that scorched the very earth in its path. The air hung heavy, thick and arid, the kind that didn't just fail to quench thirst but seemed to actively induce it, leaving a gritty dryness in the mouth and throat. Across the opulent thoroughfare, just beyond the imposing black wrought iron gates of a sprawling residence, an elderly woman was perpetually seated. She sought the meager shade offered by a solitary, modest tree, its leaves barely offering respite from the intense glare, her ancient gaze fixed intently, almost obsessively, upon those grand gates, as if anticipating the arrival or perhaps the emergence of someone or something of immense significance. Her attire was visibly worn, faded with time and use, her wrap tied snugly, perhaps protectively, around her slender, stooped waist. Her face was a roadmap etched with countless lines, each furrow a testament to years of hardship and exposure, her hands calloused and rough, testaments to a life of labor and the relentless march of age. She had occupied that very spot for hours beyond counting today, just as she had done with unwavering persistence, day after day, over the preceding 3 long years. Her origins remained shrouded in mystery to the local inhabitants. No one even bothered to inquire any longer, her quiet, persistent presence having become normalized. She simply existed there, an intrinsic, unmoving element of the bustling streetscape, as much a fixture as the ubiquitous panhandlers in the chaotic marketplace or the noisy vendors hawking groundnuts by the dusty roadside. The security personnel stationed vigilantly at the imposing gates had witnessed her there with such monotonous regularity that her presence had effectively faded into the background. They no longer consciously registered her as anything out of the ordinary. Initially, they had made concerted attempts to dislodge her, seeing her as an unwelcome anomaly that disrupted the polished facade of the residence. They had yelled at her, their voices gruff and impatient, drenched her with cold water from a hose, and even menaced her with the threat of involving the local authorities, the police, citing loitering laws, but she never reacted in the expected way. She never argued, never raised her voice in protest, never physically resisted their efforts. She would merely retrieve her small, meager satchel, a worn canvas bag containing her few possessions, shift a short, uncomplaining distance down the pavement, and resettle herself just a few feet away, her gaze unwavering, patiently returning to its silent vigil upon the gates. As time elapsed, their initial persistence and annoyance waned considerably, replaced by a weary indifference. She posed no discernible threat to the security or privacy of the residence, never attempted to climb the walls or force her way in, and she never solicited sustenance or currency, never extended a begging hand. She simply remained there, a silent, watchful figure, perpetually waiting. One afternoon, a young maid from the household staff, named Aisha, emerged from the gates carrying a small refuse bag filled with household waste destined for disposal. As she proceeded towards the large dustbin situated near the wall, she cast a fleeting, sympathetic glance at the elderly woman beneath the tree and couldn't suppress a soft sigh. It was, frankly, impossible not to feel a pang of sympathy for her solitary, enduring presence and the silent story her stillness seemed to tell. She appeared so frail, so utterly exhausted, yet she never departed, never gave up her vigil. "Mama, why do you remain seated here each and every day?" Aisha inquired, her voice gentle despite the casual nature of the question. The elderly woman slowly raised her head, her movements stiff and deliberate. Her eyes, though they lacked the bright luster of youth, held a profound depth, a reservoir of unspoken pain and long-held secrets. "I am waiting," she responded simply, the words barely audible, carried away on the dry breeze. Aisha furrowed her brow, a look of genuine confusion on her young face. "Waiting for whom? For what?" The elderly woman offered a faint, almost imperceptible smile, a fleeting expression that didn't reach her eyes, but remained silent, offering no further explanation. She merely directed her gaze back towards the imposing, silent gates, her focus unwavering. Aisha sighed softly and shook her head gently, a gesture of compassion mixed with resignation. She reached into the pocket of her uniform and extracted a small loaf of bread she had perhaps saved from the kitchen. "Here, Mama, please eat something," she urged, placing the simple offering beside the woman on the ground. She quickly retreated back into the house, a small act of kindness completed, before the head maid or any of the stricter staff could catch her engaging with a stranger, especially one so persistently present outside the gates. Within the grand residence, life unfolded as usual, oblivious to the quiet drama just beyond its walls. The grounds were expansive, meticulously maintained, adorned with vibrant blossoms of every hue and painstakingly manicured lawns that stretched like green carpets. Expensive automobiles, sleek sedans, and large SUVs were parked along the winding driveway, gleaming in the sunlight, symbols of wealth and power. And the dwelling itself, the mansion, resembled something one would only encounter in the glossy pages of high society magazines, a monument to success. It belonged to Chief Enkay Namdi, a magnate in business, a man whose name commanded both widespread fear and deep respect in the corporate world. At that very moment, Chief Enkay was in his private study, a room of polished wood and leather, reviewing various business dossiers, his mind sharply focused on complex transactions and strategies. He was a tall, imposing figure with broad shoulders and discerning eyes that seemed to miss nothing. His entire demeanor, from his measured movements to the set of his jaw, exuded an aura of absolute authority and unwavering confidence. He had toiled relentlessly, sacrificing personal time and comfort for his considerable accomplishments, and possessed absolutely no tolerance for distractions or inefficiency. "Sir, the board meeting is scheduled for precisely 3 o'clock, his assistant, Mr. Obi, a discreet and efficient man, informed him from the doorway. Chief Enkay acknowledged with a brief, sharp nod, his eyes still scanning the documents before him. "Ensure everything is prepared down to the last detail. I expect no errors, no surprises." "Yes, sir. Everything is in order." Just then, Kwasi, the chief security guard, a man of considerable build and experience, entered the office and paused briefly, a hesitant look on his face, before speaking. "Sir," he began, his voice slightly awkward, "that elderly woman is outside again." Chief Enkay's pen hesitated momentarily over a contract, but he did not lift his head, his focus seemingly unbroken. "Which elderly woman?" he asked, his tone indicating impatience with the interruption. "The one who positions herself by the gates daily. She has been there since sunrise once more, just like always." Chief Enkay sighed, a sound of weary impatience escaping his lips. "And what, precisely, do you anticipate me to do about it, Kwasi?" he asked, his voice tinged with annoyance. Kwasi scratched his head, uncertain how to phrase the recurring issue. "She asks for nothing, sir. She causes no trouble. All she does is gaze at this house, your house, as if it possesses some deep significance for her, some magnetic pull." He continued, a note of perplexity in his voice. "We have repeatedly attempted to move her along, to persuade her to leave, offering small sums of money or directions elsewhere, but she steadfastly refuses to abandon her spot." Chief Enkay finally raised his head, his expression carefully inscrutable, revealing none of his thoughts. "Disregard her," he ordered, his voice firm. "As long as she does not cause any disruption, does not impede traffic or security, simply let her remain where she is." Kwasi nodded, accepting the directive, and departed the study. However, as he stepped outside the main entrance, heading back towards his post, he found himself involuntarily casting a glance towards the imposing gates. The woman was still there, a small, persistent silhouette against the vast backdrop of the mansion, still observing, still anticipating, a silent, unwavering sentinel. What exactly was the object of her protracted, silent vigil? What secret did she hope to unravel? As the hours wore on, numerous individuals entered and exited the grand residence, guests arriving, staff leaving for errands, delivery personnel. Yet the elderly woman stayed put, a seemingly permanent fixture. Dusk descended, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, and still, she remained. Night fell completely, wrapping the street in darkness, illuminated only by the distant streetlights. And then, abruptly, precipitation commenced, large, heavy drops of rain splashing onto the dry ground. She finally gathered her small satchel, the canvas dampening instantly, and rose slowly, her joints protesting audibly, stiff and aching from the prolonged sitting. With a final, lingering look that seemed to imprint itself upon the heavy metal gates. She turned her frail form towards the street, slowly melting into the deepening shadows of the approaching night. Yet, everyone who had observed her, every staff member and security guard, was certain of one thing: her return on the morrow. She always returned. The sun ascended gradually the following morning, casting long shadows. Madame Adwoa Mensa, Chief Enkay Namdi's mother, a woman of elegant bearing and formidable presence, observed the elderly woman seated outside the gates, once again beneath the small tree, as her driver skillfully maneuvered the luxury vehicle out of the residence gates. She frowned, her perfectly smooth brow creasing with a look of displeasure. "Who is that woman?" she inquired sharply of the driver, her tone indicating she expected a clear explanation. "Madam, she is an old woman who's been coming to sit here for some time now, for many days, perhaps weeks," the driver replied, choosing his words carefully, aware of his employer's temperament. He added, trying to minimize the issue, "She causes no inconvenience to anyone, madam. All she does is fix her gaze upon the gates, simply sitting there." Madame Adwoa's countenance clouded over further, her expression growing stern. "She has been here for years," she stated, correcting him, her voice low and tight. "Yes, madam," the driver conceded, sensing the shift in her mood. "The staff are quite weary of her persistent presence, finding it strange and unsettling." Madame Adwoa's hands tightened around the expensive leather handbag in her lap, her knuckles turning white. Her gaze lingered on the woman outside, a look of deep-seated anxiety and something akin to fear flickering in her eyes, quickly suppressed. "Ensure that Chief Enkay Namdi," she instructed, her voice dropping to a near whisper, laced with urgency, "never becomes aware of her. He must not know she is here." The driver cast him a peculiar look in the rearview mirror, a flicker of confusion crossing his face, but offered no verbal response, simply nodding in understanding and continuing down the road. The elderly woman persisted outside the gates, day after day, her patience an unwavering, unyielding force. She had journeyed this far, endured this long vigil, and would not yield now, not when she felt she was so close. Regardless of the duration required, regardless of the heat or the rain, she would wait, for one certainty anchored her resolution, providing the strength she needed. Someday, the truth, her truth, would cease to be concealed behind the imposing walls of that magnificent, secretive residence. The dwelling was a constant hive of activity, a microcosm of wealth and power in perpetual motion. Vehicles continuously arrived and departed, their engines humming. Drivers sounded their horns impatiently. Security guards in crisp uniforms directed traffic, managing the flow of people and cars. Maids bustled about in their immaculate uniforms, carrying out their duties, keeping the machine of the household running smoothly. But no one, absolutely no one, ever accorded attention to the fragile woman seated just beyond the gates. She was simply part of the scenery, an inconvenience to be ignored, until this day. Today, Kofi, the youthful security guard, the one who had offered her kindness before, approached her once more, a small plastic bag clutched in his hand. He crouched beside her, lowering himself to her level, and gently set the bag on the ground. "Take this, Mama," he offered, his voice soft and respectful. "I purchased some kuss for you, fresh from the vendor down the street." The elderly woman turned towards him, her movements slow and deliberate, her lips curving into a smile of profound gratitude that transformed her worn face. "May the Almighty bless you, my son," she murmured, her voice raspy but sincere. Kofi shrugged modestly, a slight blush rising on his cheeks, uncomfortable with the praise. "You cannot sit here day after day, week after week, without nourishment, Mama," he said, his concern genuine. He glanced involuntarily at the imposing residence behind him before lowering his voice, speaking conspiratorially. "Mama, why do you persist in staying here? Why do you waste your days? Chief Enkay Namdi will never take notice of you, never acknowledge your presence." He added, a touch of harsh reality in his tone, "Even if by some miracle he does, do you truly believe he will care? That he will stop his life for an old woman outside his gates?" The elderly woman picked up the bag of kuss and took a small, deliberate bite, chewing slowly, savoring the simple flavor, lost in her thoughts for a moment before speaking. "He will care," she murmured quietly, a conviction in her voice that surprised Kofi. He is not aware yet. He lives in ignorance. But when he discovers the truth, when the veil is lifted, he will care. He must. That is precisely what you've been asserting for the past 3 years, Mama. Kofi responded gently, the futility of her weight weighing on him. This gentleman, this Chief Enkay Namdi, he doesn't even acknowledge your existence. He looks right through you. The elderly woman simply smiled, a private, knowing smile that hinted at a deeper understanding than Kofi possessed. Not far off, Jomo, another security guard, older and more cynical, observed their interaction with a stern expression. His eyes narrowed with disapproval as Kofi returned to his station. Jomo summoned him aside a few minutes later, his voice low and serious. "You would do well to cease conversing with that elderly woman, Kofi," he warned, his tone sharp. "She is trouble. She is not what she seems." Kofi furrowed his brow, confused by Jomo's vehemence. "Why would you suggest that, Jomo? She is just a harmless old lady, sitting quietly." Jomo leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper, emphasizing the gravity of his words. "You fail to grasp the situation, boy. You don't understand who is involved. Madame Adwoa Mensah absolutely does not desire Chief Enkay Namdi to hear anything whatsoever concerning that woman, not a single word. She issued a strict directive, a command, never to permit her close to the gates, never to engage with her. If she discovers you providing her with food, showing her kindness, you risk losing your employment, your livelihood." Kofi's eyes widened in surprise and alarm. "Why? Why would Madame Adwoa insist that he must not know about the woman? What is so important about her?" Jomo surveyed their surroundings discreetly, his eyes scanning the driveway and the house, as if ensuring no one else was eavesdropping on their private conversation. Then he whispered, his voice heavy with suspicion, "I cannot say for certain, Kofi, not with proof, but I sense there is something she is concealing. Something significant. Something connected to that woman outside." A shiver coursed down Kofi's spine, a sudden understanding that this quiet, persistent woman was somehow linked to a deeper, hidden truth within the powerful household. That evening, as the sun commenced its descent, painting the sky in fiery hues, a dark, expensive SUV drew up in front of the grand residence. The heavy wrought iron gates swung open smoothly, operated electronically, and Chief Enkay Namdi emerged from the house, impeccably attired in a sharp navy blue suit, the very image of corporate success. His phone was pressed to his ear, and his voice was resolute, decisive, as he spoke urgent business. "I require that transaction to be finalized before the conclusion of the week," he stated, his tone allowing no room for negotiation or failure. "No justifications, no excuses." He strode purposefully towards the waiting SUV, his mind fully absorbed in complex business matters, in deals and figures. He did not perceive the elderly woman seated outside. He never had consciously registered her presence in his daily routine. But today, there was a subtle, almost imperceptible difference. As the vehicle began to pull away from the curb, gathering speed, the elderly woman slowly, deliberately, rose to her feet. She watched him, this man she had waited for so long, with eyes filled with profound emotion, a complex mix of love, sorrow, and a deep longing, something that had remained suppressed and hidden for decades. And then, for the very first time in 3 long years of motionless waiting, she advanced a single step closer to the imposing gates, a small but significant act. The guards at their posts tensed, noticing the deviation from her usual stillness. Jomo began to move towards her, his expression one of caution. "You are not permitted to cross here, Mama," he cautioned, his voice firm but not unkind. The elderly woman disregarded him completely. She raised her hand slightly, a frail hand reaching out, as though attempting to touch him across the physical and social divide, attempting to connect. The SUV accelerated past her, a blur of dark metal and tinted glass. And in that fleeting second, perhaps prompted by an inexplicable instinct, a subconscious pull, Chief Enkay turned his head. His gaze flickered momentarily towards the elderly woman situated outside the gates, a figure he usually filtered out of his awareness. He frowned almost imperceptibly, a brief contraction of his brow. There was something about her, something in the way she stood, in her outstretched hand, that captured his attention, something that pricked at his consciousness. But then the vehicle was gone, speeding away down the street, taking him with it. The elderly woman allowed her hand to fall back to her side, the gesture completed and yet unfulfilled. She had endured a 3-year wait, an eternity of quiet persistence. And now, for the first time, he had directed his gaze toward her. It was merely a second, a fraction of time, but it was sufficient. For 3 years, she had been imperceptible to the powerful man behind the gates, a ghost in his periphery. But today, even if only for a fraction of a moment, Chief Enkay Namdi had looked in her direction. It was a small thing, a flicker of acknowledgement, yet it represented a fissure in the seemingly impenetrable wall between them, a crack in the facade of his ignorance. She possessed boundless patience, the kind forged in hardship and long suffering. She had waited 3 years. She could endure a little longer, now that she knew she wasn't entirely invisible. Inside the grand residence, Chief Enkay sat in his study, the large room feeling suddenly too quiet, a glass of expensive whiskey in his hand, the amber liquid swirling. His thoughts were ostensibly occupied with commercial concerns, with the complexities of the deals he was orchestrating. Nevertheless, a small, seemingly insignificant detail persistently gnawed at the edges of his mind. That elderly woman outside his gates. For some inexplicable reason, the brief sight of her, the fleeting glance he had given her, lingered in his consciousness, a quiet disruption. There was nothing particularly noteworthy about her appearance, nothing to distinguish her from any other impoverished person he might see on the streets, merely another panhandler, he presumed, occupying space where she had no legitimate reason to be. And yet, why did she seem so disconcertingly familiar? Why did her image refuse to fade? With a sigh of frustration, he dismissed the thought, pushing it away. He had more pressing matters requiring his attention, deals worth millions, responsibilities that demanded his full focus. Later that evening, as Chief Enkay Namdi was preparing to depart for a significant business assembly, an important evening function, he found himself automatically glancing towards the gates once more, drawn by that persistent, nagging feeling. He was unsure why he did it. Perhaps it was mere habit forming subconsciously, or perhaps it was that peculiar sensation he had experienced the previous night, the unsettling flicker of recognition. And then, for the second occasion in 3 years, his eyes met hers directly. She was already observing him, as she always was, a silent, watchful presence. Chief Enkay Namdi's brows furrowed, a deeper line than before. Something about her fixed gaze unsettled him profoundly. It lacked the desperate, pleading look characteristic of a beggar seeking charity or attention. It was knowing, steady, as though she possessed knowledge about him, about his life, that remained hidden from himself, secrets he was unaware of. He quickly averted his gaze, feeling a sudden, inexplicable discomfort, and entered his waiting vehicle, the protective shell of his luxury car. But as the car sped away from the gates, his fingers drummed against his knee in quiet vexation. Why did he harbor the persistent impression that this elderly woman was specifically awaiting him, that her vigil was directed solely at him? What did she want? Who was she? That night, for the first time in a considerable period, Chief Enkay Namdi found sleep elusive, his mind racing, unable to shake off the image of the woman and the unsettling questions she provoked. Chief Enkay Namdi was clearly not himself over the next few days. The subsequent morning, he was seated at the opulent breakfast table, adorned with fine china and silver, barely partaking of his meal, pushing the food around his plate. His mind was restless, consumed by thoughts he could not comprehend, by a disquiet he couldn't articulate. That elderly woman. Why was she perpetually stationed outside his gates, a silent, unwavering sentinel? Why did she regard him in that particular, unsettling manner? What was in her eyes? "Enkay, what troubles you, my dear?" Madame Adwoa inquired, her voice smooth and solicitous, delicately sipping her tea from a porcelain cup. She was positioned opposite him at the large table, her expression composed and serene, yet keenly observant of his unusual state. Chief Enkay Namdi sighed, massaging his temple as if to alleviate a headache brought on by his turbulent thoughts. "It is nothing of consequence, mother," he replied dismissively, attempting to brush off her concern. Madame Adwoa's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly, a tiny flicker of something, annoyance, suspicion? in their depths. Then why do you appear so distressed, so distracted? You are not yourself. He hesitated for a long moment, weighing whether to share his unsettling thoughts, before finally speaking, compelled by the persistent unease. There is an elderly woman who sits outside our gates daily, he began, choosing his words carefully. I have never really paid her any heed before. She was just part of the background, but recently I took notice of her, truly saw her, and I do not understand why, but something about her disquiets me greatly. She feels familiar somehow. A fleeting glimpse of apprehension, sharp and immediate, darted across Madame Adwoa's eyes, but it vanished so swiftly, masked by practiced composure, that Chief Enkay Namdi almost missed it entirely, questioning if he had seen it at all. She carefully set down her teacup, her movements precise and controlled. There are impoverished individuals everywhere, my son, she stated smoothly, her voice dismissive. The streets are full of them. You ought not to concern yourself with such trivialities, such common sights. They are not your burden. Chief Enkay Namdi leaned back in his chair, his unease deepening. She is not like the others, mother, he insisted, sensing a difference he couldn't explain. She does not solicit. She merely sits there, day after day, and observes. She just watches the house, watches me. Madame Adwoa's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around the table's edge beneath the cloth, but her voice retained its composure, though a slight tension was now evident. She is likely deranged. Ekon. Mentally unwell. Simply ignore her. Dismiss her from your thoughts. She means nothing. Chief Enkay Namdi scrutinized his mother's countenance, his gaze sharp and assessing. He had dedicated his entire existence to mastering the art of reading people, their body language, the subtle micro-expressions that betrayed hidden emotions, their concealed anxieties and true intentions. These skills had been instrumental in his success as a businessman, allowing him to navigate complex negotiations and understand his opponents. And at this very moment, applying those honed skills, he could discern clearly that his mother was being untruthful. She was hiding something. But why? Before he could pursue the matter further, to press her for the truth, the head maid entered the dining area, announcing the start of his busy day. Chief, your automobile is prepared and waiting. Chief Enkay Namdi set his unsettling thoughts aside for the moment, compartmentalizing them, and stood up from the table. A demanding day filled with meetings and decisions lay ahead. But as he exited the house and approached his waiting car, a resolve solidified within him. Today, just for a moment, he would take a closer look at that woman, the one who haunted his thoughts. The elderly woman, as was her custom, her unwavering routine, was seated outside the gates, beneath the modest tree, her posture serene, almost meditative, her hands clasped neatly in her lap. Chief Enkay approached her slowly, deliberately, crossing the short distance from the gate to where she sat, studying her features more closely than ever before, the intricate network of wrinkles on her face, the strands of graying hair visible beneath her wrap, the quiet yet intense look in her eyes that held such depth and mystery. And then, for the very first time in his 42 years of life lived behind those gates, he addressed her directly, breaking the long-standing silence and the invisible barrier between them. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice firm but not unkind, a mixture of curiosity and the lingering unease he felt. The air around them seemed to still, the sounds of the street fading into the background. The elderly woman lifted her head, her gaze meeting his directly, and for a brief instant, something complex and profound flickered in her eyes, a blend of sorrow, hope, recognition, and something more ancient and powerful. Chief Enkay could not tear his gaze away from hers. He was captivated by the intensity of her look. "I posed a question," he repeated, his voice a little sharper now. "Who are you? What is your name?" The elderly woman parted her lips to speak, a word forming, but before she could utter a single syllable, a voice, sharp and urgent, called out from behind him, slicing through the tense silence. "Ekon." He turned sharply, startled, to see Madame Adwoa Mensah hastening towards him from the house, her face a mask of meticulously composed concern, yet something in her eyes betrayed a sense of urgency, a hidden panic. "You are running late for your engagement," she stated swiftly, efficiently, reaching him and taking his arm with a firm grip, attempting to steer him away. "Come, my son, we must depart immediately." You have important people waiting. Chief Enkay hesitated, his gaze flickering back and forth between his mother's anxious face and the silent, waiting figure of the elderly woman. Something was undeniably amiss, profoundly wrong, and he felt it keenly. But Madame Adwoa's grip on his arm intensified, a silent, forceful pressure. "Let go, Enkay," she reiterated, her voice more firmly this time, a hint of command replacing the concern. After a protracted, tense pause that seemed to stretch into an eternity, he finally turned away from the elderly woman, pulled by his mother's insistence and the weight of his scheduled life. Without another word, without a backward glance, he entered his waiting car, and the heavy gates closed behind him, sealing the woman outside once more. The elderly woman remained seated, observing the closed gates, the departing car, her posture as still as before. She had come close today, remarkably close, closer than ever before, but she possessed fortitude, a deep well of resilience. She had endured a 3-year wait. She could persevere a little longer, now that the first step had been taken. For the first time in 3 years, Chief Enkay had looked at her, had spoken to her, had acknowledged her existence, however briefly. She had witnessed the bewilderment, the flicker of recognition in his eyes, the confusion he couldn't hide. Inside the grand residence, Madame Adwoa Mensa paced restlessly within the confines of her luxurious bedroom, the opulent surroundings a stark contrast to her inner turmoil. Her fingers trembled slightly as she clutched a glass of water, raising it to her lips. But it was not dehydration that prompted her to reach for it. It was pure, unadulterated dread. For years, she had ensured the secret remained deeply buried, hidden beneath layers of wealth and lies. For years, she had exerted absolute control over every aspect of Enkay's life, over the narrative of their family. But today, standing outside the gates, it had nearly unraveled. That woman, she had dared to approach, dared to speak, dared to break the rules. Madame Adwoa ground her teeth together in frustration and fear. She needed to act decisively, immediately, and swiftly before her careful construction crumbled entirely. She set the glass down on a nearby table, her hand still trembling, and retrieved her telephone. The call was answered after only 2 rings, a low, professional voice on the other end. "She is still positioned outside," Madame Adwoa declared, her voice sharp, commanding, devoid of any lingering warmth. "I desire her gone tonight."
Permanently.
No trace. A low, resonant voice on the other end responded, cold and efficient. "Consider it accomplished, madam. It will be done." Madame Adwoa terminated the call and exhaled shakily, a wave of relief mixed with revulsion washing over her. She had invested too much, sacrificed too much, built an empire upon this secret, to permit this persistent elderly woman to jeopardize everything she had worked for, everything she had taken. No, she would not permit it to happen. Chief Enkay sat in his spacious office, the quiet luxury of the room a stark contrast to the turmoil in his mind, rhythmically tapping a pen against the cool, polished glass surface of his desk. His meeting had concluded over an hour prior, leaving him free, but his mind remained stubbornly preoccupied, circling back to the same image, the same unsettling feeling. The elderly woman. Something about her, about their brief interaction, disquieted him profoundly. His fingers tightened around the pen, the plastic threatening to snap. A profound sense of unease permeated him, a gut feeling he couldn't shake. He had spent his lifetime making astute decisions, relying on concrete information, on logic and analysis, never allowing sentiment or inexplicable feelings to obscure his judgment. And yet, his instincts clamored, signaling that something was profoundly wrong, that this woman was not just a harmless beggar, that there was a hidden danger or a hidden truth. With a sigh of frustration, he reclined in his chair, running a hand through his hair, and reached for his telephone. He dialed a number he rarely used for anything other than direct instruction. Kofi, the young security guard's voice, responded instantly, sounding surprised but alert. "Yes, Chief? How can I help you?" "Kofi," Chief Enkay began, his voice low and serious. "I want you to monitor that elderly woman outside the gates. Do not make contact with her. Do not attempt to send her away. Do not interfere. Simply observe her. Keep a watchful eye. He paused, then added, his voice hardening with emphasis, "And if anything, anything at all, should befall her tonight, anything whatsoever, I require immediate notification. Do you understand?" "Yes, Chief," Kofi responded, a note of understanding and concern entering his voice. "I understand perfectly." Chief Enkay ended the call and rubbed his temples, the headache returning. He was unsure why he was undertaking this action, why the stranger had suddenly become so important, but he had learned long ago that when his intuition, that deep, primal sense, suggested something was amiss, something significant, it typically was. And this time, it wasn't just suggesting, it was screaming. That night, the elderly woman sat in the darkness, beneath the modest tree, gazing at the silent, imposing gates, waiting as she always did. She remained unaware of the impending danger, of the clandestine call made within the grand residence. She did not know that Madame Adwo-Amensa had set events in motion that threatened her very existence. She possessed but a single conviction, an unwavering belief. She had endured a long, arduous wait, and soon, very soon perhaps, the truth would finally come to light, the secret would be exposed. The street was hushed, quiet in the late hours, save for the distant drone of passing automobiles on a nearby larger road. The elderly woman remained seated, her weary eyes fixed on the gates, waiting, her patience almost superhuman. Then she detected it, a footfall. Soft, deliberate, muffled. Not the casual step of a passerby. She did not immediately turn, her long experience teaching her caution, but her heart commenced a rapid, fearful rhythm against her ribs. Another step closer this time. Then another. This time she turned her head slightly, her eyes adjusting to the gloom, and saw them. Two figures, large and imposing, clad in dark, nondescript garments, advancing towards her with quiet precision, their movements purposeful and silent. An inner warning signal, honed by a lifetime of hardship and vulnerability, alerted her instantly. This is not ordinary. This is danger. She gripped the edges of her worn wrapper and slowly propelled herself upward, pushing herself to her feet, a difficult, painful process. Her joints protested audibly, a chorus of creaks and groans, but she disregarded the discomfort, focusing solely on the potential threat. One of the men spoke, his voice low but carrying clearly in the still night air. "Mama, it is late," he said, the words sounding solicitous, but feeling menacing. "You should not be seated out here alone, exposed." She offered no response, her gaze fixed on them, assessing the threat. The other man stepped towards her, closing the distance. "Come, old woman, let us escort you to a secure location, a safe place." A chilling sensation settled like ice in her abdomen. She had lived extensively, witnessed much cruelty and deception in her life. She recognized the palpable presence of danger, the cold certainty of malicious intent, and at this very moment, it was thick in the atmosphere around them, suffocating. She took a step backward, putting a small distance between herself and the approaching figures. "Leave me be," she said, her voice surprisingly steady despite her fear. The first man sighed, a sound of impatience. "Old woman, do not make this difficult for us. We are simply trying to help." They advanced closer, their movements predatory, and then a sudden voice, sharp and clear, rent the silence of the night. "Hey, what is transpiring here? Stop right there." The two men froze in their tracks, startled by the unexpected interruption. The elderly woman turned, her eyes widening in surprise and relief as she discerned a figure emerging from the shadows near the gate. Kofi, the young security guard, had been observing from a distance, precisely as Chief Enkay had instructed him, hidden from view. He had witnessed the two dark-clad men approach the elderly woman, seen their deliberate movements, and sensed the immediate disquiet in the air, the threat she faced. Now he stepped forward into the faint light, his presence a challenge. "I inquired," he repeated, his voice firmer now, demanding an answer. "What is taking place here?" "Leave her alone." The two men exchanged a swift, silent glance, their plans thwarted by the unexpected intervention. Then, without uttering another word, without explanation or protest, they turned and dissolved back into the darkness from which they had emerged, melting away like shadows. Kofi rushed to the elderly woman's side, his concern evident. "Mama, are you all right? Are you hurt?" She nodded, her body still trembling slightly from fear and the sudden adrenaline surge. Kofi looked in the direction where the men had disappeared, his mind racing. He understood the implication perfectly. Someone powerful desired this woman's removal, someone who had access to men willing to carry out such actions in the dark. And now he had a strong suspicion of who that individual was. He retrieved his phone from his pocket and initiated a call, dialing Chief Enkay's number. "Chief, it is I, Kofi," he announced the moment Chief Enkay answered, his voice urgent. "You instructed me to keep watch over the elderly woman outside the gates." "Chief, I believe someone just attempted to harm her." There were two men. A heavy silence ensued on the other end of the line, thick with unspoken questions and dawning realization. Then Chief Enkay's voice, sharp and devoid of its usual warmth, cut through the silence. "Bring her inside. Now." "Mama, we must go inside immediately," Kofi urged, taking her arm gently. The elderly woman hesitated for a long moment, her eyes fixed on the imposing gates, a mixture of anticipation and apprehension warring within her. She had anticipated this moment, dreamed of it, waited for it for 3 long years. But now that it had arrived so abruptly, so dramatically, she was uncertain if she was truly prepared for what lay beyond those gates, for the confrontation that awaited. "Inside," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Yes," Kofi affirmed firmly, understanding her hesitation, but knowing the command was absolute. "Chief directed that I should bring you inside. It's for your safety." For a moment, her eyes clouded with uncertainty, with the weight of decades of waiting and fear. Then, with a slow, deliberate intake of breath, she offered a small, resolute nod. The moment had arrived. Kofi led her towards the imposing wrought iron gates, approaching the smaller entry door set within the larger structure. He knocked twice, a signal to the guards inside, and the smaller entry door swung open, revealing the faces of the other security guards, their expressions a mixture of bewilderment and shock at seeing Kofi with the persistent woman from outside. Kofi paid no heed to their questioning looks or silent astonishment. His sole objective, his singular focus, was to ensure the safety of this elderly woman, acting upon the chief's urgent directive. Inside the grand residence, Chief Enkay stood near the magnificent central staircase, his mind racing, thoughts colliding like storm waves. Kofi's words on the phone had sent an unnerving chill down his spine, a cold dread settling in his gut. "I believe someone just attempted to harm her."
Why?
Why would anyone wish an old beggar woman harm? It defied all logic, all reason. Unless there was something more to this woman, something significant, something hidden, that made her a threat to someone powerful. A sound at the entrance hall caused him to turn, his senses heightened. Kofi entered first, his hand gently guiding the elderly woman inside the opulent foyer. And there she stood, the woman he had merely glanced at for 3 years, the persistent figure at his gates. The woman whose presence had been a persistent irritation, a nagging riddle, an unresolved query in the back of his mind. Now she stood within his home, on his polished marble floor, looking small and vulnerable amidst the grandeur. For the first time, Chief Enkay looked at her not as a vague shape outside his window, but with genuine, focused attention, truly seeing her. She was frail, her hands calloused and rough, her simple wrap old and faded, but her eyes. There was something hauntingly familiar about them, something that reached deep within him and unsettled him to his core, triggering a subconscious recognition he couldn't place. He advanced slowly, drawn forward by an invisible thread of destiny. "Who are you?" he asked again, his voice quiet now, filled with a different kind of intensity. The elderly woman swallowed hard, her throat dry. Her voice emerged as a mere whisper, hesitant. I am." She paused, looking at him, her eyes full of emotion. "Not yet," a silent voice seemed to say within her. "Not here, not under these circumstances, not with others potentially listening." She lowered her head slightly, gathering her composure. "I am merely an impoverished woman, sir," she said, a carefully crafted lie meant to delay the inevitable. Chief Enkay's eyes narrowed, detecting the hesitation, the lack of a direct answer. The elderly woman raised her head once more, her gaze meeting his directly again, a quiet strength returning to her eyes. I have waited for such a long time, she stated, her voice gaining a little firmness, simply to see you, to converse with you, to tell you something important. His chest constricted, a sudden tightness, making it difficult to breathe. Before he could formulate a response, before he could demand an explanation, footsteps echoed from the grand staircase, announcing another presence. Madame Adwoa Mensa. Her costly gown swayed and rustled as she descended, her face initially a mask of astonishment and controlled outrage at seeing the woman inside. But Chief Enkay Namdi, with his honed ability to read people, perceived something beneath the carefully constructed facade, something cold, something calculating, something deeply fearful. She halted at the base of the stairs, radiating disapproval, and turned her attention, sharp and demanding, to Kofi. "What is she doing in here?" she demanded, her voice laced with authority and fury. Kofi hesitated, glancing towards Chief Enkay, seeking confirmation and support. Chief Enkay's voice was resolute, cutting through the tension. "I requested him to bring her in, mother. She is here at my invitation." Madame Adwoa's fingers curled into fists at her sides, hidden within the folds of her gown, but her expression remained outwardly serene, a chilling composure. She turned her gaze, hard and assessing, onto the elderly woman, a silent challenge passing between them. "Mama, you ought not to be here," she said, her voice sickeningly sweet, a veiled threat beneath the polite words. "You must be weary from sitting outside. Allow me to make arrangements for you to be escorted to a comfortable location, a proper place of rest." The elderly woman looked directly at her, her gaze unwavering, filled with ancient pain but also newfound resolve. And a silent communication passed between them, a look fraught with peril, a history of conflict, a deep, unspoken antagonism. "I am comfortable here," the elderly woman stated quietly, her voice steady, refusing the offer. Chief Enkay frowned, his confusion deepening. He could sense it distinctly now, feel it hanging in the air like a heavy cloak. The palpable tension in the room, the way the elderly woman and Madame Adwoa Mensa regarded each other, the currents of hostility and fear passing between them. Something was fundamentally wrong. Something significant, something dark, was being concealed within these opulent walls, hidden by the woman who had raised him. And for the first time in his privileged, controlled life, he yearned for the truth, no matter how painful it might be. The room fell silent once more, the tension thick and suffocating. Madame Adwoa Mensa was the first to break the quietude, her composure beginning to crack under the pressure. "This is preposterous, Enkay." Her voice was smooth, attempting to regain control, yet an undercurrent of frustration and desperation was now clearly discernible. "Enkay, you have no acquaintance with this woman. You do not know her history. She is simply an indigent individual, a beggar, who has been positioned outside our gates for years, an inconvenience. Why are you permitting her entry into our home? This is highly improper." The elderly woman did not recoil from the harsh words. Her gaze remained fixed upon Madame Adwoa Mensa, a silent challenge. Chief Enkay folded his arms across his chest, his stance firm. "And why does that cause you such distress, mother?" he asked, his voice pointed, direct. Madame Adwoa Mensa stiffened visibly, caught off guard by his direct question. "Distress me?" She emitted a forced, brittle laugh, a sound devoid of humor. "Enkay, I am simply concerned for your well-being, for the security of our home. Are you aware of the multitude of dangerous individuals who masquerade as beggars? What if she is a deceiver, a fraud? What if she is here to create difficulties, to cause us harm or scandal?" The elderly woman finally spoke, her voice steady and clear, cutting through Madame Adwoa's protests. "I am not present to cause difficulties, madam. I merely wish to speak my truth." Chief Enkay Namdi's eyes darkened with mounting suspicion, his intuition screaming at him now. "Then speak," he commanded, his voice hard, demanding the truth. The elderly woman opened her mouth, then hesitated, glancing briefly at Madame Adwoa Mensa, whose face was taut with anxiety, before redirecting her gaze back to Chief Enkay. "Not here," she murmured softly, definitively. "Not in her presence. What I have to say is for your ears alone." Madame Adwoa Mensa's face contorted with outrage and fear. "Pardon me? You dare to enter my dwelling, and now you assert that I, the mistress of this house, cannot remain here? That I must leave. The elderly woman offered no response, no argument. She simply waited, her gaze fixed on Chief Enkay, her patience a powerful, silent force. Chief Enkay Namdi studied her for a prolonged moment, weighing the strange request, the undeniable tension, the feeling that the air was thick with unspoken secrets. Then, without diverting his gaze from her face, he stated, his voice calm but carrying absolute authority, "Mother, kindly leave us. I wish to speak with this woman privately." A fleeting trace of raw panic crossed Madame Adwoa's face, unmistakable this time, but she swiftly concealed it behind a mask of strained dignity. "Enkay, you cannot be serious. This is absurd." "I am," he replied, his voice resolute, unyielding, leaving no room for argument. "Please, mother, withdraw. Leave the room." For the first time in many years, perhaps for the first time ever, Madame Adwoa Mensa felt a chilling sense of dread permeate her very core, cold and absolute. This was serious. Exceedingly serious. Her control was slipping. She compelled a stiff, unnatural smile to her lips. "Very well, Enkay. If that is what you wish, I shall retire, but I will remain close by should you require my assistance. I am always here for you." She turned, her movements stiff and deliberate, and exited the room, the rustle of her gown fading as she ascended the stairs, leaving Enkay and the elderly woman alone in the vast entrance hall. Within the room, the heavy silence returned, broken only by their breathing. Chief Enkay Namdi gestured toward the large, comfortable chair situated near the staircase. "Be seated, Mama," he said, using the respectful term Kofi had used, a small gesture of courtesy. The elderly woman complied, moving slowly but gracefully, and settled into the chair. He pulled a smaller chair and sat opposite her, leaning forward, scrutinizing her features once more. The deep wrinkles, the worn hands resting in her lap, the fatigued eyes that held so much untold history. And yet, despite the signs of age and hardship, there was something about those eyes that felt profoundly disquieting, stirring a deep, buried memory. "Familiar. Speak," he commanded, his voice low and serious, demanding the truth she had withheld earlier. The elderly woman drew a deep, steadying breath, preparing herself for the revelation. "I have observed you for a considerable duration, Enkay Namdi," she began, her voice soft but clear, carrying weight. His fist clenched involuntarily, a sudden tension seizing him. "Who are you?" he demanded again, needing the name, the connection. The elderly woman exhaled slowly, her gaze steady on his. "I am the woman who has carried your truth for over 40 years. Your real truth." A peculiar coldness, an icy dread, radiated through Chief Enkay Namdi's chest, spreading through his limbs. "My truth?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Yes." The elderly woman leaned forward slightly, her eyes filled with a sad understanding. "The truth concerning your genuine identity. Concerning who you truly are, where you came from." Chief Enkay Namdi's heartbeat accelerated, a frantic drum in his chest. His mind reeled, unable to grasp the implications of her words. She sighed, a sound of deep weariness, rubbing her hands together, calloused palm against calloused palm. "I am uncertain how much you are prepared to absorb, how much your heart can handle," she said, her voice gentle despite the gravity of the subject, "but you must comprehend that this is a narrative of deep anguish, of cruel appropriation, of a truth that lay buried and concealed behind wealth and power for decades." Chief Enkay Namdi leaned forward further, compelled by a force he couldn't resist, his pulse throbbing in his temples. "Recount everything to me," he urged, his voice tight with urgency. "Tell me the entire story, from the beginning." The elderly woman inhaled deeply, gathering her strength, then, in a voice imbued with sorrow, with the weight of a lifetime's pain, she commenced. "It all began in a dwelling not dissimilar to this one, a large, affluent house, 42 years ago. I was young then, barely more than a girl, when I commenced working as a maid in an affluent household, serving a wealthy family. I possessed neither parents nor siblings. I was alone in the world, merely myself and my aspirations for a more promising existence, a better life away from poverty." She paused, her gaze distant, lost in the painful memories of the past. The residence belonged to a formidable man, a chief, and his spouse. They were prosperous, esteemed within society, but their marital union was fraught with difficulty, plagued by unhappiness and disappointment. The wife was infertile. She could not bear children. The elderly woman continued, her voice lowering, becoming hushed, recounting a deeply private tragedy. She had offered countless prayers, undergone periods of fasting, consulted medical practitioners across the country, even traditional healers and spiritualists, but nothing altered her condition. No offspring arrived. The years passed, and her womb remained empty. Chief Enkay Namdi's throat tightened, a sudden, chilling premonition seizing him. An internal whisper, a cold, knowing dread, suggested that she was not merely recounting the tale of any couple, she was speaking of someone he knew, someone intimately connected to his own life. The elderly woman clasped her hands together tightly, her knuckles white, her voice trembling slightly as she reached the most painful part of her story. The husband of this woman, my employer, was impatient. He yearned desperately for a child, an heir, and was prepared to undertake any measure, any cruel act, to acquire one. Her voice became unsteady, thick with emotion and remembered trauma. One evening late, he entered my chamber, my small, humble room in the staff quarters. "I was merely a maid," she resumed, her voice filled with the helplessness of the past. "I held no authority, no power, no voice to refuse him. He seized what he desired from me, violently took his pleasure, and I had no alternative but to endure the violation, the degradation." A profound, heavy silence descended upon the room, the weight of her words crushing. Chief Enkay Namdi's hand tightened its grip on the armrest of his chair, his knuckles turning white. She was not simply narrating a generic, tragic story of a wealthy man and a poor maid. She was relating her own personal experience. And it was a history of perfidy, of suffering, of a profound injustice. "I conceived," the elderly woman whispered, the word heavy with unintended consequence. "It was not planned. It was not desired. It was the result of violence. But within me, life began to develop, a tiny spark growing in the darkness. And then the discovery. The wife, my mistress, she discovered the truth of my pregnancy." Chief Enkay Namdi's pulse quickened, his mind racing, connecting the pieces with a terrifying speed. "She was devastated initially," the elderly woman continued, her voice filled with bitter memory, enraged and heartbroken by the betrayal and the reminder of her own barrenness. But then, in her despair, she perceived an opportunity, a cruel solution. She possessed no child, and I carried one within me, her husband's child. Therefore, in her desperation and twisted desire for a child, she reached a terrible decision. "What decision?" he inquired, his voice hoarse, barely recognizable. The elderly woman met his gaze directly, her eyes filled with a searing pain that mirrored the horror dawning in his own. "She seized my child. She waited, with cold, calculated patience, until I had given birth, until you were born. Then, while I was weak and vulnerable, she wrenched my infant, away from me, took you from my arms. She then proclaimed to the world, to everyone who knew them, that the child, that you, were hers, born to her. She forcibly expelled me from the dwelling, threw me out like refuse, and meticulously obliterated all evidence of my existence, of my time there, of my connection to you." Her lips trembled with suppressed emotion, with the pain of that ancient loss. She possessed everything: wealth, authority, social standing, and now she possessed my offspring. But I possessed nothing, only the memory of holding you, the emptiness of my arms, and a broken heart. Chief Enkay Namdi's heart pounded fiercely in his chest, a violent, erratic drumbeat. A child taken from his mother. A monumental falsehood presented to the world. A boy nurtured in a grand residence, raised in privilege, believing he was born into opulence and legitimacy. He felt a wave of intense dizziness wash over him, the room swaying precariously. His mind strained to reject the burgeoning thoughts, the horrific implications, but the disparate elements of her story were converging with unsettling precision, fitting together like pieces of a terrible puzzle. The elderly woman regarded him steadily, her gaze unwavering, filled with a deep, aching anguish that mirrored the chaos in his own soul. She witnessed it. The precise moment the terrible, life-altering truth, impacted him, the moment his world began to shatter. Chief Enkay Namdi finally spoke, his voice raw, strained, a mere whisper.
Who?
Who was the child? He asked, though a part of him already knew the devastating answer. The elderly woman inhaled sharply, a shaky breath. Her lips trembled, parting slightly as she whispered the single word that would change his life forever, his real name. You. Chief Enkay Namdi's world seemed to halt, the spinning room momentarily freezing. The single, devastating word reverberated in his consciousness, a hammer striking metal, shattering the foundation of his reality.
You.
He could perceive the tumultuous pounding of his own heart in his ears, feel the blood roaring in his head. He stared at the elderly woman, his eyes wide with disbelief, waiting, silently imploring her to retract the statement, to say she was mistaken, to say it was a different child. But she did not. She merely observed him, her eyes brimming with unshed tears, with emotions so profound it was almost unbearable.
No.
No.
No. N.
Chief Enkay Namdi whispered, shaking his head slowly, numbly, in utter disbelief. That is impossible. You are mistaken. The elderly woman exhaled shakily, a sound of deep sorrow and resignation. It is the unvarnished truth, Enkay Namdi. Your truth.
N.
His voice was stronger now, a desperate, wounded cry of denial. My mother is Madame Adwoa Mensa. She raised me. She nurtured me. She loved me. She nurtured you. Yes, she raised you in this house, but she did not give you birth. I brought you into the world. I bore you. Chief Enkay Namdi rose from his chair abruptly, unable to sit still, his hands trembling uncontrollably, his legs feeling weak. It felt as though the very ground beneath him was collapsing, opening up into a terrifying abyss. You expect me to credit this narrative, he muttered, his voice thick with disbelief and anguish. That my entire existence, my formative years, my mother, that all of this was a fabrication? A lie? The elderly woman swallowed audibly, her throat tight with emotion. I never desired for you to uncover the truth in this manner, in a moment of confrontation. I wished for a gentler way. Chief Enkay Namdi turned back sharply, facing her fully, his eyes blazing with a mixture of fury, bewilderment, and something else, a deep, cold apprehension about his own identity. Who are you? He demanded again, needing a name, a tangible connection to this impossible reality. And what do you seek from me after all these years? What do you want? The elderly woman's lips quivered, her resolve momentarily faltering under the intensity of his pain. I am your mother, she whispered, her voice soft, filled with the weight of that identity. Aluwasi. The way she uttered his name, his authentic name, the name he had never known, sent a peculiar, unsettling chill down his spine, resonating in a place deep within him. I bore you, she continued, her voice regaining strength, fueled by the need to tell her story. I carried you in my womb for 9 months, felt your every movement within me, endured the pain of bringing you into this world. I held you in my arms when you first entered the world, felt your tiny weight against my chest, heard your first cry. Her voice fractured, breaking with the remembered anguish. And then, I lost you. They took you from me. Chief Enkay Namdi clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. No, he reiterated, clinging to the only reality he had ever known. I was born into affluence. I was raised in this grand residence, in comfort and privilege. My father, he was a chief. He loved me. Your father was the one who violated me, the elderly woman retorted, her voice suddenly raised, sharp with righteous anger and pain, refusing to let him cling to that illusion. The words pierced through him like sharp daggers, striking at the heart of his identity. He recoiled slightly, physically flinching from the brutal truth. She continued, her voice a torrent of long-suppressed pain. He was desperate for progeny, for an heir, and I was an accessible target, vulnerable and alone. When I became pregnant, his wife, Madame Adwoa, she did not immediately expel me. She waited. She meticulously planned, with cold calculation, and when I delivered you when you were born, she forcibly took you from me, tore you from my arms, and then drove me from the house, from your life, proclaiming me to be nothing, insignificant, a lie she would erase. Chief Enkay Namdi felt utterly disoriented, adrift in a sea of lies. Lies, lies, lies. His entire life. He yearned to denounce her as a liar, a madwoman seeking attention or money. He wished to scream, to rage against this impossible reality, but something deep within him, something he was unwilling to acknowledge fully, credited her account. The pieces fit. The strangeness around his birth he had sometimes felt, his mother's overprotective nature, the questions never fully answered. Why now, he articulated, his voice strained, raw. Why appear after all these years? Why wait so long? The elderly woman emitted a shaky breath, tears finally welling in her eyes, blurring her vision. I presented myself years ago, she stated softly, her voice filled with the sadness of ignored pleas. But I was nothing to you then, Enkay. Merely a beggar outside your gates, a face in the crowd, simply an elderly woman you failed to perceive, whom you looked through as if I were air. A single tear coursed down her wrinkled cheek, a testament to 3 years of silent suffering and longing. But I never ceased my vigil because I knew, deep in my heart, that one day you would heed me, that you would truly see me, and hear my story. Chief Enkay Namdi squeezed his eyes shut tightly, pressing his fingers against his temples, wishing he could make this terrible revelation disappear. This could not be real. It was unfathomable, a nightmare from which he couldn't wake. Chief Enkay Namdi paced the room like a confined creature, trapped within the walls of his own shattered reality. His heart pounded uncontrollably in his chest, a frantic, disbelieving rhythm. His mind was in complete disarray, thoughts crashing and swirling like a chaotic storm. Everything he had known, everything he had believed about himself, about his family, about his entire privileged existence, had just fragmented into a million sharp, painful pieces. He turned sharply towards the woman still seated calmly in the chair, her gaze steady and full of sorrow, his breathing ragged. "Do you possess substantiation?" he demanded, his voice cold, detached, yet inwardly he was anything but composed, his emotions a raw, open wound. "Do you have proof? Any evidence?" The elderly woman met his gaze, sorrow flickering like a dying flame in her weary eyes. Understanding his need, his pain. "I possess no documentation," she said softly, her voice quiet but clear. "No birth certificates listing my name, no official papers, no photographic evidence from that time. They were powerful. They expunged me completely from your life, from the records, from the narrative. They erased me as if I had never existed, as if I had never given birth to you." Chief Enkay Namdi clenched his fist at his side, frustration and despair building within him. "Then how am I to believe you?" he asked, the question laced with anguish. "How can I accept this incredible story based on your word alone?" She sighed, a sound of deep, ancient weariness, reaching inside the worn folds of her simple wrapper for something hidden close to her heart. Slowly, with deliberate care, she withdrew a small, aged piece of fabric, a baby's garment, a tiny piece of cloth, faded and old with the passage of time, but adorned with something embroidered onto it. Chief Enkay Namdi stepped closer, drawn by an irresistible pull. He squinted at the delicate stitching on the fabric, straining to read it in the light of the grand hall, Alawasi. His body stiffened, a jolt of profound shock running through him. It was his name, his rightful name, the name whispered by the woman before him, not the appellation Madame Adwoa Mensa had conferred upon him, the name he had borne for 4 decades as the son of a millionaire. No, this was his initial name, the name given to him by the woman who bore him, before everything was stolen, before his identity was stripped away and replaced by a lie. His throat constricted with emotion, his hands trembled uncontrollably as he extended them towards the small piece of cloth, reaching out across the vast gulf of years and secrets, but he recoiled before making contact, unable to touch the tangible proof. "No," he whispered again, shaking his head in a final act of denial. "This substantiates nothing. It is merely a name, a happenstance, a coincidence." It proves nothing about my identity." The elderly woman swallowed hard, her eyes glistening with unshed tears, the pain of his denial adding to her burden. "Peer within yourself, my son," she whispered, her voice a soft plea. "Listen to the voice in your heart, in your soul. Have you never sensed that something was absent from your life, that something was fundamentally amiss, out of place?" Chief Enkay Namdi's jaw tightened, the argument silencing his protests. Indeed, something within him had perpetually felt discordant, a quiet dissonance beneath the surface of his perfect life. His mother, Madame Adwoa Mensah, had consistently been overly protective, almost to the point of being possessive, as though she harbored a constant, deep-seated fear. A fear of losing him, perhaps, but more likely a fear of the truth surfacing, of her secret being exposed. He recalled his childhood, the way she never permitted him to develop close bonds with anyone outside their immediate family circle, isolating him in their world, the way she invariably became agitated, defensive, when he posed seemingly innocent questions regarding his birth or his early years. Had she been concealing something monumental, something dark and terrible, all along? He turned back to the elderly woman, his gaze fixed on her, seeking answers in her eyes. "Inform me of one thing," he stated, his voice low and steady now, cutting to the heart of the matter. "Did you ever attempt to reclaim me? Did you try to take your child back?" A single tear finally escaped her eyes, tracing a path through the wrinkles on her cheek, a testament to her enduring sorrow. "I made the attempt," she whispered, her voice fragile with the memory of failure. "I pleaded. I contended. I fought with every ounce of strength I possessed. But they possessed financial resources, wealth beyond my imagination. They possessed authority, influence, connections to the police, to those in power. And I was merely an impoverished girl, a disposable maid, discarded like refuse once I was no longer needed." Her lips quivered, recounting the brutal reality of her powerlessness. "They cautioned me, Enkay. They threatened my life. They said that if I ever attempted to assert my claim to you, if I ever came near the house again, they would annihilate me, crush me completely. Consequently, I waited. I waited for you to discover me, for you to see me, hoping that one day you would learn the truth and come looking for your mother." Chief Enkay Namdi drew a profound, shaky breath, the weight of her words, the scale of the deception, pressing down on him. If her assertion was accurate, if this impossible story was true, then he was a purloined child, a deception wrapped in prosperity and comfort, built on the suffering of the woman before him. He clenched his fist, the raw reality hitting him with full force. His purported mother, Madame Adwoa Mensah, the woman who had raised him, owed him the truth, the whole, unvarnished truth, and he intended to extract it tonight. He would get to the bottom of this, no matter the cost. Chief Enkay Namdi stood before his mother's bedroom door, the polished wood gleaming in the dim light, his heart pounding erratically in his chest. Or was she even his mother? The question hammered in his brain. His fists were clenched so tightly at his sides that his fingernails dug into his palms. He had devoted his entire life to loving, respecting, and safeguarding Madame Adwoa Mensah. She was his anchor, his family, his world. But now doubt, corrosive and consuming, infiltrated his very being like a virulent malady, consuming everything he believed he understood, everything he thought was real. Was she truly the woman who had endowed him with life, who had brought him into the world with love and care? Or was she the one who had confiscated it, stolen his true identity and connection to his origins? He drew a deep, bracing breath, steadying himself, and pushed the door inward, entering the private sanctuary of the woman he had called mother. Madame Adwoa Mensah was seated calmly on the edge of her expansive, luxurious bed, enveloped in her characteristic silk robe, the fabric shimmering. She was calmly sipping tea from a delicate cup, a picture of serene domesticity, as was her custom in the evenings, until she perceived his countenance, the raw, unfiltered emotion written on his face. Her hands froze around the teacup, her usual composure shattering instantly. Something in his expression, in the intensity of his gaze, caused her to still completely, her face blanching slightly. "Enkay," she articulated cautiously, her voice tight with apprehension, sensing the gravity of his mood. "What is the matter? What has happened?" He stepped inside, closing the door firmly behind him, sealing them in the room with the explosive truth that was about to be revealed. "Who am I?" he asked again, his voice low, devoid of any softening, cutting directly to the core of his torment. She blinked, a flicker of confusion, manufactured or real, in her eyes.
What?
"What kind of question is that?" I inquired, Mother. Chief Enkay pressed, advancing slowly towards her, his gaze unwavering, piercing her facade. "Who am I? Tell me the truth." Madame Adwoa Mensah's lips parted slightly, confusion still evident in her eyes, but a new, underlying fear was beginning to surface. "Enkay, what manner of inquiry is that? You are my son. You are Chief Enkay. You know who you are." Chief Enkay took another step closer, forcing the issue. "That elderly woman downstairs, she recounted a story to me. A story about a young maid who was violated by her employer, about an infant who was taken from her arms shortly after birth, about a wealthy woman who was unable to bear children and required one to claim as her own, as an heir." Madame Adwoa Mensah remained silent, utterly still. The quietude hung heavy between them for a protracted, agonizing moment, and then slowly, deliberately, she placed the teacup on the bedside table, her hand trembling. She raised her eyes to meet his, and what he beheld in their depths shook him to his very core, confirming his deepest fears. There was no astonishment, no bewilderment, no denial. Merely a profound, weary resignation, an acceptance that the long-buried secret had finally clawed its way to the surface. Chief Enkay's breath emerged as a shaky gasp, the air suddenly too thin to breathe. "Tell me she is fabricating," he whispered, a desperate, final plea. "Tell me she is simply some deranged woman who invented these stories, these terrible lies, to attract my notice, to extract money or attention." "I cannot," she responded, her voice barely audible, thick with the weight of her confession, the two simple words sealing his fate, confirming his worst nightmare. The room seemed to tilt and spin violently around him. Chief Enkay staggered backward, raising a hand to his head, his mind reeling, unable to process the enormity of the revelation. He felt as though the walls were converging upon him, pressing in, as if the very floor beneath his feet was poised to engulf him entirely, swallowing him whole into a void of non-existence. She was not fabricating. The elderly woman was speaking the truth. Everything she had imparted to him, the agony of her violation, the perfidy of his father, the cruel theft of his very existence, his identity, was accurate. His entire life, the foundation upon which it was built, had been a monumental, carefully constructed falsehood. "I acted as I deemed necessary," she stated quietly, defensively, attempting to justify the unjustifiable. "As you deemed necessary?" His voice cracked with sudden, righteous indignation, with the pain of betrayal. "You abducted me from my mother. You stole a child. She was a domestic servant." Madame Adwoa Mensah snapped suddenly, her voice sharp, shrill, her composure momentarily breaking, revealing the contempt beneath. "She possessed nothing. What kind of existence could she have provided for you? A life of indigence, of hardship, of struggle and poverty? Is that what you desired for yourself, Enkay? Is that the life you would have chosen?" Chief Enkay recoiled from the harshness of her words, from the sheer, chilling pragmatism of her justification. Madame Adwoa took a deep, controlling breath, visibly regaining her composure, lowering her voice to a calmer, more persuasive tone. "You are the person you are today because of me," she stated, attempting to cling to her version of reality, to minimize her crime. "Because of us. Because we gave you everything." She clasped her hands together, her fingers intertwining, a gesture of false sincerity. "Yes, I acted wrongly. Yes, we perpetuated a deception, a lie that lasted for decades. But tell me, Enkay, if you could reverse time, if you could go back to that moment, would you genuinely elect to be the offspring of a poor maid, living a life of uncertainty and want, instead of the life of power, privilege, and success you currently possess?" He stared at her, his chest rising and falling rapidly, his breath coming in ragged gasps. She had just confessed everything, the brutal truth, and she was not even pleading for his forgiveness, for leniency. She was rationalizing it, attempting to convince him that her terrible act was somehow justified, a benevolent choice made for his benefit. Chief Enkay Namdi turned away from her, unable to bear looking at her face for another second. He required air. He required space. He needed time to process the catastrophic implosion of his reality, the shattering of his identity. And one fact, one terrible, undeniable fact, was unequivocally clear. The woman who had raised him, the woman he had loved and revered, who he had called mother for 42 years, was not his mother. She was his abductor. A thief who had stolen his life and built her own happiness upon his mother's agony. Chief Enkay Namdi stormed out of Madame Adwoa Mensah's bedroom, leaving her alone with the wreckage of her lies. His hands trembled uncontrollably, fueled by a mixture of rage, grief, and profound shock. He had spent 42 years subsisting on a lie, living a borrowed life. The woman he had called mother was a pilferer, a deceiver, a woman who had stolen him from his true mother's arms and presented him to the world as her own, erasing the truth of his origins. He stumbled down the corridor, the familiar luxurious surroundings now feeling alien and false, his mind in a chaotic whirl. He needed to breathe. He needed to escape the suffocating confines of the house, of the lie. As he reached the grand staircase, intending to descend and leave, he detected hurried footsteps behind him, frantic and desperate.
Enkay, please wait.
That was Madame Adwoa Mensah's voice, strained and fearful. She was desperate now, seeing her carefully constructed world collapsing. He clenched his jaw, setting his face in a hard line, and continued walking towards the stairs. She pursued him relentlessly, seizing his arm at the foot of the stairs, her grip surprisingly strong, pleading with him. "Please, my son, don't leave." He violently wrenched his arm from her grasp, pulling away as if burned. "I am not your son," he declared, the words raw and final, his voice hard and unyielding, cutting through the air like glass. She froze, the devastating words silencing her. Tears welled up instantly in her eyes, streaming down her face, melting her composure. "I raised you," she cried, her voice cracking with emotion, with a desperate attempt to cling to her maternal claim. "I nourished you. I clothed you. I sacrificed for you. I bestowed my affection upon you. I gave you everything. You stole me." Chief Enkay Namdi interjected, his voice dangerously low, vibrating with suppressed fury and pain. His fists were clenched at his sides, his body rigid with tension. "You stole me from my real mother, from the woman who gave me life, and expunged her existence from my life, from my history." Madame Adwoa Mensah shook her head frantically, denying the gravity of her actions, clinging to her justification. "I did it to secure a better life for you, Enkay. I did it out of love for you, a mother's love." Chief Enkay Namdi emitted a bitter, hollow laugh, a sound filled with pain and cynicism. "Loved me?" He turned to face her fully now, his eyes blazing with an intense, all-consuming fire of emotion. "If you genuinely loved me, mother, if there was any truth in your affection, you would have disclosed the truth. You would have allowed me to make my own determination, to know my real mother. Instead, you constructed my entire life upon a foundation of falsehoods, built on her pain." She sank to her knees on the polished marble floor, tears streaming down her face, her elegant gown pooling around her, as she clasped her hands together in supplication, a desperate, fallen queen. "Enkay, please, I implore you," she sobbed, her voice thick with desperation. "Do not abandon me. Do not walk away from the life we built." He swallowed hard, his own throat tight with conflicting emotions. This was the woman who had raised him, who had been a mother figure for 42 years, flawed and deceitful as she was. Irrespective of her terrible actions, he could not erase that reality, the shared history, the moments of genuine care amidst the lies. Yet, simultaneously, he could not disregard her deeds, the cruel theft, the lifetime of deception. He could not pretend they were inconsequential, that his life had not been built on a crime. He looked down at her, kneeling before him, his heart heavy with a complex tangle of conflicting emotions, pain, anger, sorrow, and a deep sense of loss for the mother he had believed in. Then, without another word, unable to articulate the storm within him, he turned and exited through the grand entrance door, leaving her kneeling there, her pleas unanswered. He did not look back, could not bring himself to do so. Outside, the nocturnal air felt cold against his skin, a stark contrast to the heated emotions raging within him. But it was not solely the physical chill that caused him to shiver. It was the oppressive, crushing weight of the truth bearing down upon him, the full, devastating reality of his stolen identity, his stolen life. For 3 years, the elderly woman had maintained her silent vigil at the gates, a constant, overlooked presence. His real mother. His heart ached with a profound sorrow, a deep empathy for her suffering. How immense her pain must have been, he thought, the realization flooding him with remorse. How much anguish had she silently endured, sitting there day after day, watching the son who didn't know her, the son who had been taken from her. The pain, the profound loss of a stolen child, the torment of witnessing him mature from a distance, fully aware that he did not even acknowledge her existence, that he saw her merely as a stranger. All those instances when he had dismissed her as a deranged beggar, an inconvenience. All those days he had passed her without a second glance, caught up in the bubble of his privileged life. All those nights she had presumably wept herself into slumber, questioning whether he would ever recognize her, ever know her truth. He felt nauseous, nauseous with regret for his blindness, nauseous with shame for his ignorance. He turned back, a sudden, urgent need propelling him, rushing back into his home, back to where he had left the elderly woman, his mother, waiting. And for the first time in 42 years, since the moment he was ripped from her arms, he embraced the woman who had given him life. She broke down completely at his touch, collapsing into his arms, her frail body racked with sobs, releasing decades of pent-up grief and longing. Chief Enkay Namdi held her tightly, burying his face in her hair, and wept alongside her, tears of regret, recognition, and profound sorrow mixing with her tears of relief and pain. For the first time in 42 years, she held her son in her arms again. And for the first time in his life, Chief Enkay Namdi felt whole, felt found. The world around them faded into insignificance, the grand residence, the wealth, the power, the lies, the betrayals. Nothing else held importance in that moment. Only this singular, sacred moment of reunion. Only her presence, the warmth of her body against his, the reality of her being his mother.